All right, hello there. I'm Max Kreminski. Can I be heard? Cool, okay. Yeah, so I'm running the storytelling lab at Midjourney. What that is, I'll get to in a second. But broadly speaking, I'm going to be talking about the things that we've been doing in the context of this thing that we're building called Patchwork, a collaborative AI-supported ideation canvas for world building to support intent elicitation, which is sort of getting more out of the users in terms of what they want to create. So just to give a bit of background on Patchwork, it's sort of this interactive collaborative space where you and other users can all sort of sit together and use the AI to help you come up with ideas for aspects of a world that you're all building together, sort of a fictional setting. You can use text, you can use images. There's kind of a language model that you can sort of query for things like character concepts based on the sort of initial prompt that you've created for the setting. You can sort of elaborate these characters into little sort of hybrid textual visual stories. You can come up with sort of characters that are related to one another, have relationships, or sorry, have motivations, have goals, and that kind of drive the story forward. And all of these are supposed to sort of feel consistent because the AI is helping you weave them all into a coherent sort of self-supporting setting. So you might, for instance, have an initial setting prompt, something like a starship shaped like organs, get out some sort of basic images from the Midjourney image generation, ask for a character who might be a protagonist of this world. We get this character, Tensia Hartley, a sort of spaceship navigator who has this weird, cool tentacle helmet thing on. We then sort of ask for a foil character, maybe, who has sort of this interesting, more mechanical helmet, and they sort of embody different thematic values or different sort of factions in the world, maybe. And then even sort of ask for comic panel renderings of these characters doing different things. So starting to elaborate this into more and more of a story or a setting that you can sort of build your own sort of shared space for fictional ideation. All of that said, there's a catch. Language models right now are not very good at generating divergent material given a similar initial prompt, which means that if you as the user are entering a very short prompt, especially a prompt that's maybe sort of drawn from a bank of known good ones, or is one of the obvious things people tend to think of, we've seen Cat Pirate come up a lot for some reason, then the language model is going to start giving you things that feel very similarly to other people's responses for that same prompt. And we've actually done some studies on this in a different sort of context that found that basically there's this homogenization effect that occurs with language models in the ideation loop, where the more a language model supports you in sort of coming up with divergent ideas, the more your ideas will be sort of both like large in number, large in sort of like the detail amount in each idea, but also similar to the ideas that other people have generated in the same task context. So this is actually a really pressing thing for anyone trying to use language models for supporting divergence or supporting dehomogenization, because by default, they kind of pull you towards the center of mass of what everyone else has already thought. So if you want to get away from this problem, we've decided that the problem of assisting creativity via language models is really one of eliciting user intent, because that initial prompt is the thing that language model is conditioning on. And so you need to get more and more out of the user to sort of take that distinctiveness and feed it back into the ideation process. So what the language model is refracting back at you is where the interesting sort of novelty is coming in. And so in order to support this, we're kind of reframing all of our work as this intent elicitation process of trying to figure out from the user what unique ideas they would like to put into the story world and how they would like to sort of specifically steer this world building process. And in practice, there's a few different problems with this. Number one is underexpression of intent. By default, users don't tend to specify most of what they want. They don't actually have a strong sort of like pressing feeling that they need to sort of sit at this initial text prompt and sort of type in everything that they're thinking about. They sort of type in the first couple of words of that idea and then hit enter and see what they get back. And then only after more and more loops do they actually start to elaborate more to fix the problems they see with what they're getting back from the AI. So by default, they tend to enter these very short initial prompts. We also see fixation. When you're trying to infer intent, users tend to become focused in creative processes on a particular way of achieving their expressive goals. And this means that their actions, even though they're aimed at a very broad or high-level expressive goal, can actually all be pointing towards a much narrower, specific way of realizing that goal. And so when you try to infer an intent from those actions alone, you end up inferring the low-level intent and not the high-level intent. So you can't give them alternative ways of reaching that goal or suggest them like other ways of doing what they're trying to do. And so this fixation problem is very important if you're trying to get around the difficulties of inferring intent from actions alone. And finally, we see a lot of uncertainty in intent, particularly in creative processes. The creative process is itself one of intent creation or discovery, right? Like you don't arrive at a creative process like writing or drawing with a fixed intent in your head that just needs to be sort of drawn out of you by the tool. You actually are figuring out what you want to do in conversation with the materials, kind of a reflective conversation with the situation, as you see in a lot of design literature. And this process of sort of taking yourself from an uncertain to a more certain intent is something that the AI support needs to like sort of help you with. And so this combination of underexpression, fixation, and uncertainty makes it hard to just sort of guess at what users want. You need to kind of draw it out of them and help them construct their intent in more specific ways. So we have these 3 preliminary design patterns that we've sort of arrived at in preliminary testing of Patchwork, and then we're going to kind of try to elaborate further on in the future. And I'm going to briefly describe these here. Number 1 is ask, don't guess. So it's often very tempting, I think, when you have this sort of big data approach, especially to like sort of looking at user interactions, to try to infer what users want from what they're doing and do that alone. The difficulty there is, of course, that if what you're just looking at is actions, then you have the fixation problem very strongly of their actions might all be directed at this much narrower thing, what they're actually trying to get at. And so we sort of have been moving towards is explicitly asking the user for input when the model is uncertain about some aspect of what they're trying to accomplish, moving towards even open-ended text questions where they can type in whatever they want as a response. Secondarily, refining via examples. When you have an initial intent that's kind of short or compact, maybe underexpressed, and you want to draw it out into a more elaborated form, it's often very difficult to get users to explicitly say what they want, but you can more easily give them a whole bunch of diverse examples and then kind of take the shared aspects of examples that they've picked as positive examples, and then kind of canonize those as part of the intent or part of the prompt. So you end up with this much more sort of easy to work with set of sort of intent aspects. And then finally, gauging creative momentum. When you're doing this proactive intervention to try to get information out of users, it can be annoying to them, right? Because you might be intervening at the wrong times or in the wrong places. And so we try to focalize our interventions at times and places where user creative momentum is low. Basically look for moments when they're more receptive maybe, or even more looking for feedback, as opposed to just constantly peppering them with it. In practice, what does this look like? Well, ask, don't guess actually has us giving the user these text messages from the AI or from the LLM that it's formulated. So in this case, we have this initial sort of context of the Cold Emu War, a story world that we use as a testing story world a lot. And normally this is a story world where you have a human versus emu conflict of some sort. In this case, the questions that the LLM started asking actually drew the user in an unexpected direction towards this more sort of like romance storyline centered between Talon and his childhood sweetheart, who are both birds from different bird factions that have sort of been drawn towards different factions in this war. So some interesting novelty there. For refining via examples, we can do things like take this initial character and then generate a bunch of images that are consistent with this character using some of the new image generation stuff we've been rolling out. But then ask the user to pick the ones that are most representative of how they see that character being. And then use this to kind of further refine what this character's identity is, what their character personality traits are, and so on. And then finally, engaging creative momentum, we can start to ask questions like how many unanswered questions have been asked by the AI relative to how much the users have already put on the board. Are users apparently active but not actually modifying the board contents a lot right now? And also where on the board are users currently focused to sort of help get them out of fixation or tunnel vision. And of all of this is basically trying to avoid the specter of Clippy asking the annoying questions constantly. We still need to evaluate these concepts more strongly, but we wanted to introduce this sort of broad conceptual frame of intent elicitation and sort of hope that it inspires further ideation and discussion around how best to achieve this goal in AI-supported co-creativity. Thank you.
Okay, any questions? Yes. Yes, you have a microphone.
Thank you. One of the undesired, in my opinion, and others that I know, effects of Gen AI is that you very quickly go from a thought to a very finalized product, and you lose the sketchy, loosey, artifacts that are essential in the creative process.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see that playing out here in terms of is this is the story here to tell that is, no pun intended, that is just don't even think about images yet. Just is the story. Just help me craft the story, and then help me craft maybe a very drafty, sketchy version of images, and then only then go for the final high fidelity. And the same applies to the design, UI, etc.
Totally.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, for sure. So we actually, in the homogenization work I mentioned, we've been talking about this idea of inferential distance between the AI output and the thing that you're trying to sort of turn into a finished product. And we think that higher inferential distance between the output and the product is the kind of thing that causes more creativity to come into the process. And so we're actually playing a lot with that at the text level right now of trying to generate maybe short evocative key phrases, but not complete character descriptions, or not complete passages of text, but just the building blocks that you would need to compose that text on your own. And starting to try to give the user more of these little stepping stones where they're weaving together the outputs of the AI, which are incomplete or deliberately imperfect, into something that is more of a finished product at the end, because that's where you start to get really like the human involvement that makes it unique. So I think that's right on the nose, basically.
quick one. You're talking about Mid-Journey, I think is where you started this. So it seems like we're leaning more towards a natural language and write it out, let the AI understand and then interpret. From fooling around with it, you can try to be specific, you can try to use commas, and sometimes it seems to just hit the buzzwords and doesn't come back with, the intention. Is there like, what's the best source of information to understand better what actual syntax you could use instead of a natural language? Is there a syntax behind the scenes that you could use with parameters that may help move you in the right direction?
Totally, yeah. And I think a lot of this is on the model developers to come up with better control sort of implementations for these kinds of models. We've been doing a lot with what we call style references and character references recently, where you can provide specifically an image as the style reference, an image as the character reference, and then that character or that style are applied as input to the generation for additional sort of like prompts that you're putting in. So I think decomposing the basic text prompt into more different sort of control elements like that is a thing that we should be trying to do more. Also showing maybe the weights that different actual parts of the text that you've put in as a prompt have on the output. That's a thing we've been experimenting with as well. But these are all sort of like relatively novel things that no one has quite like woven into a graphical interface quite yet.